Before Columbus ever set sail, the North had already touched the edges of a new world. They crossed the freezing Atlantic not for conquest or gold, but to escape, to survive, to begin again. They found a land of wild grapes, endless forest, and river overflowing with salmon. They called it Vinland. They built, they hunted, they stayed. And then they vanished. No empire followed, no graves remain. The sagas speaks in riddle. History stays silent, and what they left behind isn't just ruins. It's a question. What if discovery isn't enough? This is the story of Vikings who reached America and the land that refused to remember them. The Norse were dying, not in a flash, but in a slow, bone-deep silence. Greenland's coast had grown colder. The winter bit harder, crops failed more often, livestock starved in frozen fields with families huddled in smoke-darkened longhouses, hoping the sea would thaw before they did. The Norse, once seafaring riders and proud settlers, were now survivors, scraping by in a land that had turned against them. But the Norse were never meant to stay silent. They came from a culture carved by wind and wave. Their gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, demanded movement, boldness, honor through action. Their ancestors had crossed storm-black oceans in open boats with nothing but stars and instinct to guide them. They had burned across Europe, settled Iceland, tamed the volcanic stone of Greenland. But now they were trapped. The world was shrinking around them. So they looked west. They had heard stories. Whispers passed between fishermen and hunters. Land sighting beyond the horizon. Island with forest so dense they broke the axe. Coasts rich with animals that didn't fear men. Grapes growing wild, where the earth itself seemed to bloom without blood. For the Norse, that meant something deeper than opportunity. It meant salvation. Among them was Leif Erikson, son of Erik the Red, a man exiled from Iceland and branded an outlaw. Leif had sailed before. He had been to Norway, served King Olaf, and returned to Greenland with tales and faith. But his greatest voyage wasn't about loyalty to a king. It was about legacy, escape, redemption, and perhaps proving the stories true. He gathered a crew, some say 35, others more. Not warriors, but settlers, carpenters, farmers, hunters, people who could build a life, not just raid one. They loaded their nar, a broad-bellied ocean vessel designed not for speed but for endurance, and cast off from Greenland's bitter coast. No maps, no guarantees, just wind, waves, and sky. What they faced was not distance, it was the unknown. The North Atlantic was merciless. Fog could blind you for days. Icebergs drifted like ghosts. The sea itself seemed to whisper threats beneath the hull. But still they pressed forward, guided by sunstones and sun's arc, trusting in the sagas, in their instinct, in the hope that something better waited for them. And then land, not just one but many. First they found Helluland, the land of flat stones, cold, barren, possibly modern-day Baffin Island. They saw great white foxes darting across the rocks, but no trees, no shelter, so they moved on. Next, Markland, the land of forest, thick, wild woods, black soil, timber that Greenland sorely lacked, possibly Labrador. Tempting, but not yet home. Finally, they reached it. Vinland, the land of wine. Grapes grew wild on hillside. Meadows rolled under golden light. Salmon filled the river so thick they could be caught by hand, and the climate warmer than anything they'd known in years. A place that felt not just survivable, but forgiving, alive, a second Eden on the edge of the world. They had found it. But discovery is not the end of a story. Sometimes it's the beginning of a mystery. The land felt different. The wind was softer. The trees stood taller. The ground didn't crack under frost. It breathed. This was not Greenland. This was not Iceland. This was something new. The Norse had found Vinland, a place where the sun stayed longer in the sky, and the rivers carried fish so large and fast they could barely be held in two hands. In the hill, wild grapes grew without care, feeding birds and staining fingers. There was wood for ships, soil for crop, stone for homes. It was more than they had hoped for. It felt somewhat safe, and so they began to build. It was not a city, not a kingdom, but a foothold. Something small, something strong, a place to rest, grow, and survive. They raised long houses, simple wooden homes covered in turf and bark. They carved fences from fresh-cut trees. They lit fires that filled the dark with heat and smoke. The same skills that had built Iceland and Greenland now shaped this strange, beautiful land across the sea. And it worked. For a while, it worked like a charm. The sagas, the story passed down by word and firelights, speak in life in Vinland with a kind of wonder. Salmon is fat and rich, pasture open and full, grapes growing in places no Norse had seen before. They hunted, they cooked, they laughed. Some may have thought, this is it, this is the new beginning. But they were not alone. The sagas tell of the Skrælings, the native people of the land. We don't know their real names, we don't know their language, but we know this: they were here long before the Vikings even arrived. At first, the encounters were strange, even peaceful. There were curiosity, watching from trees, trading goods, a carved weapon exchanged for red cloth, a shared moment of silence between two people who couldn't speak the same tongue. But peace is fragile, and sometimes all it takes is one misunderstanding, one gesture, one spark, and one misstep. So they had crossed the sea for a second chance, and here it was, quiet, green, and wide open. The Norse, it looked like a gift from the gods themselves. Tall trees where Greenland had none, soft grass underfoot, air that smelled of salt and wild flowers, grapes growing on vines without effort, rivers packed with salmon, forest full of animals that did not fear the sound of boots or axes. The Norse had lived through hard winters, poor soil, and months of darkness, but there they could breathe. They wasted no time. The longships were pulled into the shore and flipped over to shelter supplies. Wood was cut, fires were built. They chose a spot near the sea, close to the rivers, and set to work building a camp. These were not survivors, they were settlers. They knew how to build turf houses, dig storage pits, and raise fences to keep animals out. They fished by hand, hunted games, gathered berries. The days were long, the nights calm. The sagas speak of a land where everything they needed was already there. The Norse likely stayed through the winter, and it's here, in the silence of snow and flame, that something began to change. They didn't just survive, they began to hope. For the first time in years, maybe in decades, there was no hunger, no frozen skin, no dying livestock. The people had warmth, shelter, and food. They told stories by firelight, laughed, made plans. Some must have thought, could this be the future? But one thing was missing, or let's say watching. The Norse soon realized they were being watched. Eyes from the tree, footsteps in the moss, voices carried on the wind, words they didn't understand. These were the Skrælings, the native people of the land. The Norse didn't know who they were. Today, historians believe they may have been the ancestors of the Bethok or Mikak people. At first, there was distance, observation, then the contact. Together, they had very strange trades like a red cloth given in exchange for animal plates, milk offered then rejected, curiosity mixed with caution. These early moments were not violent, they were fragile. Two completely different worlds staring at each other with no shared language, just gestures, sound, and fear. Then something changed. The sagas tell of a bull, a Norse animal, loose and loud, that scared the Skrellings. There are stories of a fighting over goods, misunderstood trades, and defensive actions. Whatever happened, the result was clear. The Skrellings returned not to trade, but to fight. They came with spears and stones. They moved fast, striking from the woods, vanishing just as quickly. The Norse, trained in open battle, struggled to fight in this new kind of war. The land that once welcomed them now seemed to push them out. After the attack, everything changed. The Norse slept with weapons nearby. The fires burned longer, the laughter faded, the dreams of a new home began to crack. They still had food, they still had shelter, but now they had fear. And fear spreads faster than fire, which I have already explained to you in my previous video. At first, Norse believed they could stay. They had food, shelter, even trade. But what they didn't have was peace. The Skrellings, the native people of that land, had been watching. They had seen the long houses rises. They had seen trees fall, animals hunted, land cleared, and they began to understand something the Norse didn't. These strangers weren't passing through. They were settling in. No words were spoken, but something had shifted. What once was curiosity became silence. What was once a distance became a warning. The first strike came without horns, no war drums, no march, just shadows. From the forest, the Skrellings attacked. Stones flew, spears tore through the air. Their movements were fast, sharp, and precise, a kind of warfare the Norse weren't ready for. Ambush, retreat, disappear. One Norse was killed, others were wounded. The shock hit harder than the weapons. They had crossed an ocean, but they had never truly arrived. After the attack, the camp changed. Fires were moved closer together. Guards were posted at night. People whispered instead of speaking freely. The Norse knew how to fight, but they didn't know this kind of war. In the open, they had strength. In the trees, they were blind. They built barriers. They sharpened weapons. But the truth had sunk in. They were outnumbered. They were alone. And this was not their land. The seasons shifted. The air grew colder. Snow crept into the edge of the roof. Supplies ran low. Game became harder to find. They were tired, isolated. The nearest help was Greenland, was weeks away by sea. And inside the camp, something else was breaking. Tensions grew, arguments started. Should they stay? Should they leave? Who led? Who followed? What if they couldn't survive another winter? These stories don't tell us everything, but the signs are there. The dream of Vinland was dying, not from one blow, but from 1,000 small cracks. What came next is still a mystery. The sagas grew quieter, the name blurred, the timelines slip. We don't know if the final blow was another attack or a decision made by tired hands over a smoky fire. But we know this, they left, not in a rush, not with war cries or banners, but quietly. They packed what they could carry. They pulled their longship back into the tide, and they sailed away. Vinland was over. No one truly knows why the Norse left Vinland. The sagas don't say it outright. They twist, contradict, go quiet. Some stories blame the Skrellings, say the attack became too much. Others suggest it wasn't the enemy outside that forced them home, but the fear inside them. Fear of isolation, fear of a second winter without help. Fear that even the gods had turned away. Some believe there were too few people to survive long term, that a few dozen settlers, no matter how skilled, could not tame a continent. Others think it was leadership, confusion, disputes, pride. No central voice to hold the group together when everything began to crack. And some theories go further still, that the Norse knew they could not claim this land, that the people already living there would never allow it, that this was not just dangerous land but defended land, so they left quietly. But what came after might be even stranger than their departure. The world forgot them. For centuries, the Vinland story was treated like a myth. Medieval scholars ignored it. Renaissance explorers buried it. By the time Columbus sailed in 1942, the Norse voyage were long erased from the memory. The schools taught of Leif Erikson. No maps showed his path. Why? Maybe because failure doesn't survive in the pages of an empire. Maybe because Columbus came with flags and kings behind him, and the Norse had only silence. But in truth, they were here 500 years before the world decided it mattered. And if not for a few sagas, a few ruins, and a whisper of carved woods buried beneath northern soil, we might have never known Vinland was real, and it was almost lost forever. They crossed the ocean to begin again, not as conquerors but as survivors, chasing something better than cold. They found it, Vinland, a land that gave more than it took, a land that might be the start of a new world. But discovery is not the same as belonging, and sometimes the land itself decides who stays and who fades. The Norse came with courage, skill and hope, but not with numbers, not with dominance, and not with the understanding that some lands are already spoken for. And so their story didn't end in triumph. It ended in retreat, in silence, in sagas that barely whispers the truth. Yet there is something deeply human about that, about reaching too far, hoping too much, and choosing to return when the dream became too heavy to carry. Vinland may have failed, but it also proved something powerful, that the edge of the map isn't where stories end, but where they begin. Today, the wind still blows over the grassland where they stood. The rivers still run cold and clear. And maybe, just maybe, the land remembers them, even if the world chooses to forget, because sometimes the most important stories are the ones that had vanished. Thank you for crossing the sea of forgotten stories with us. If the mystery of Vinland moved you, hit like and subscribe. For more cinematic journeys into the past, the ones history books leave behind, drop a comment below with the land remembered. If you believe that even the quietest stories deserve to be heard. Because here on CTT Stories, we don't just tell history, we give voice to the echoes. Until next time, stay curious, stay respectful, and remember, every ruins hold a story waiting to be heard. And I'll see you in the next one.